let me introduce myself. That the last time I was here, it might be when remember the name? Do you remember Molly? Anybody remember Molly?
Yes, we remember.
Yeah, Molly used to do this, and Molly now, moved on to Westwood, and I'm with her now in Westwood. I have been since she left here. But my name is Gary Hylander, and I've been doing this for a long time, doing presentations on various topics in American history, current events, American government. I have a PhD from Boston College, and they even let me in, and a PhD in American history and in American government. And presently, I teach at, well, they're beginning to retire out the old guys, me. They can get two for the price of one. So, I work at Stonehill College, and I do some work for BU and Framingham State and so forth. And what's been happening for the last dozen years or so, and I remember just when this happened, that in Easton it was the VFW or one of those groups wanted someone to come over on the week of July 4th and talk about the Declaration of Independence. And I said, I'll do it. A, it's good publicity for the college, and B, I like to get out and share. I like doing what I do. Monday morning isn't a problem for me. I like going to work. I like my job, and I get paid for it, which is even better. So I said, sure, I'll come over, and from that came this exponential growth of speaking at various groups, libraries, veterans groups, retirement homes, and it goes on and on and on. And so here I am tonight, and in chatting with Barbara, that we thought we would put together a three-part series on the year 1968. I mean, this year is the 50th anniversary of 1968, and one of the anniversaries that we'll talk about today will be two of them, and we're going to conflate them, and that will be the Tet Offensive of 1968, and how the Tet Offensive, played into the election of 1968 as well. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, which was in January of 1968. Now I'm going to go back and put some and fill in the details, obviously, but in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, which pretty much petered out end of February and March, that it became the Vietnam War was the number one issue of the 1968 election, and the Tet Offensive pushed that Vietnam War into not only what was always on the front pages, but this was the issue in the 1968 election. And I'm always mindful of the fact, and I do an awful lot of work on Lincoln and the Civil War and presidential elections and the Lincoln marriage in particular, which had its own dynamic. It might have been dysfunctional. We're up and running.
Good.
I've introduced myself, and I've preempted your introduction.
That's perfectly okay.
Okay.
And I just wanted to make sure you were all aware that this is presented by the Friends of the Whitman Public Library, and that there will be two more programs after this one in October and one.
Right. I mentioned this is a three-part series,
Yeah.
and we're focusing down on 1968.
I think that's excellent. Okay, great.
Oh, great. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
And I know you need some paperwork from me,
Yeah.
and that's on me, not you.
Okay.
It's been a busy 2 weeks and all of that with the start of the school year, the semester year. So the Vietnam War is going to be issue number one in the 1968 election. So let's go back to, I know what I was going to start to say about Lincoln. In the 1864 election, and this is a topic for another time, and that would have been the American Civil War. And should Lincoln pursue it, or should, as not General Grant, but the General Burnside, who Lincoln had fired, and now was the nominee for the Democratic Party, should we cut a deal with the South, with the Confederacy? And that question was front center in 1864. So let's go to Tet, and it's spelled T-E-T, and it's the Chinese New Year. And folks in all of Indochina, in China, they celebrate it for weeks. And people plan for months with whom they're going to visit, during the Tet holidays. We have no holiday in this country the equivalent of Tet. Even if we roll all our holidays together, and add into it all of our birthdays, it doesn't even come close. People plan for months, and what Hanoi did, and at this point it's Ho Chi Minh and others. Ho Chi Minh is alive and well. I don't know how well he is, but he's alive. And sometimes I'll refer to Hanoi as Hanoi. Sometimes I'll refer to them as the enemy, but I'm talking about the same folks. That Hanoi was looking to plan a spectacular attack over the Tet holidays, and to use the cover of two things: a truce, which was always part of the Chinese New Year, and this truce would last for weeks. Not that anybody honored it, but on paper it would be a truce. And during the truce period, the leadership in Hanoi planned to move Viet Cong troops and the army of North Vietnam into position to use the cover of the truce and the fact that there were so many people on the roads, on the buses, on those rickety trains, on sampans, making the way across all of South Vietnam. The pedestrian traffic always was heavy. And under the cover of that, to slip in enemy soldiers in a position and then to strike the length and breadth of South Vietnam. And the leadership of Hanoi hoped for two outcomes for this. Boy, they got more than they ever bargained for. And the first outcome would be that it would re-energize the anti-war movement in the United States, which had simmered down a bit. They got that one. And also that it would lead to the overthrow of President Tu, the president of South Vietnam. They didn't get that initially, but that's coming. They got much more than they bargained for in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Now, Lyndon Johnson, we could do a 15-week course on Lyndon Johnson, but that means you've got to read 7 books, take a midterm and a final, and do a 25-page paper. I don't see any hands going up. Okay, we'll pass on that for now. Lyndon Johnson, and just a word about him. There's so much to say about Lyndon Johnson, but Lyndon Johnson was a volcano of a man. I mean, he was a tsunami of a man, and Lyndon Johnson never wanted to be a war president. What he wanted to do was to give gifts to the American people, and those gifts, well, became laws and became part of a great social program known as the Great Society. That's what he wanted to be remembered for, to give gifts to the American people. So if you have a Medicare card, well, thank you, Lyndon Johnson. If you listen to National Public Radio or you watch Channel 2, thank you, Lyndon Johnson. If you fish in the Charles River, thank you, Lyndon Johnson. The Charles River is the cleanest urban river in the country, and that's the result of the Clean Water Act, under the program of the Great Society. That's what Lyndon Johnson wanted to be remembered for. Not a war president. And yet the war came to him. And Lyndon Johnson, fearful of walking on the war, I don't want to be the first president ever to lose a war. And there's so much that factors into that. That Lyndon Johnson will take a Kennedy war, that he inherited, a war that Kennedy wanted to keep low cost, low risk, low profile. Kennedy was too smart, too clever, too self-assured to get caught up in a war that 9,000, 8,000 miles away. And I've always maintained that if Kennedy had been reelected in 1964, and he would have been, that he would have begun to gradually demobilize. Low cost, low risk, no profile. Lyndon Johnson comes in. He's told by Kennedy's advisors that Kennedy would not have shut the war down, and that you need to continue the involvement, the support of South Vietnam. And Lyndon Johnson escalated recklessly. And in 1967, in order to tamp down a growing anti-war movement, certainly on the campuses and among some members of the House and the Senate, he invited home General Westmoreland, commander of American forces, and he also invited home the ambassador to South Vietnam, Ellsberg Bunker. And they were instructed by Johnson, here's the message. Here's the message, Westmoreland, to the American Congress. that we are making progress in Vietnam. No one, Westmoreland never said there's light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know where that came from. He never said it, but it became part of his alleged repertoire. What Westmoreland said is that I've left your gallant sons and daughters, and I'm proud of them, and you ought to be, you know, and that the war we will be able to consider a draw. Good evening.
Hi,
be able to consider a drawdown sometime. Begin to draw down sometime in 1968. Ellsworth Bunker made the same pitch on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and whatever. We're making progress, and General Westmoreland has told me that we will be able to begin some kind of a drawdown in 1968. Westmoreland went back to Vietnam, Bunker went back to Saigon, and the Tet Offensive exploded in January. When Westmoreland returned, his instincts were screaming at him that there's too much traffic on the roads, there's too much going on, it doesn't feel right. You know, sometimes you go with your gut, sometimes you go with your instinct. It doesn't feel right. Something's up here. And he went to see President too, and he expressed those concerns to him. And he said, I recommend, Mr. President, that you cancel all leaves, and certainly among your senior staff. I don't like what I see. And President Tu said, I can't do that, General. My soldiers, my general staff, they've been planning for months. It'll make me unpopular. So there you go. And at the end of January, the Viet Cong, the enemy, they came out of the jungle, they came out of the sewers, they came out of the hooches, and they stood and they fought. And American firepower destroyed the Viet Cong. It was Westmoreland's greatest victory. And it's not that the press back home reported it as a defeat. And they did not. They did not. The press gets a bad rap on that. But the press reported, and they were doing their job here, they asked a good and necessary question. Westmoreland and Bunker have just been here. They've told us we're making progress. This is November, right before Thanksgiving. They wanted to know who's lying to us. How did this happen? Who's lying to us? And from that came, and I know if I remember, you remember, the credibility gap. You know, the President Lyndon Johnson is lying to us. The Defense Secretary McNamara is lying to us. The Joint Chiefs are lying to us. How could this be? How could it be if we're making progress that the enemy can attack and hold the American embassy? The American embassy, the very seat of American power and authority of South Vietnam. They only held it for 6 hours. Didn't matter. They did it, didn't they? Under the very nose of Westmoreland and others. And I always like to make this point, and if we were in class, I would ask you to write this down just as I say it, that the American embassy had absolutely no military value at all, but it had great psychological value. That the American public would ask the question, how could this be that they've been able to blow a hole in the wall of the American embassy, the Viet Cong get on the grounds, and enter the embassy and hold it for 6 hours? And what made that such a dramatic story is it all came home to us, CBS, NBC, and ABC, didn't it? I mean, that war came into our living rooms completely unvarnished, and we saw it all, we heard it all. And we're perplexed by it. How could this be? And I know you remember these scenes, the Viet Cong firing out of the embassy, out of the windows of the American embassy, down on MPs and CIA operatives, you know, who were taking cover behind trees on the grounds of the American embassy and firing back into the windows, into targets that appeared in the windows of the American embassy. How could this be? And boy, did it ever re-energize the anti-war movement. And Lyndon Johnson, you know, Lyndon Johnson in the aftermath of that will retire, you know, both politically and professionally. When Gene McCarthy goes into New Hampshire, Gene McCarthy, nobody from nowhere, you know, a senator from Minnesota, you know, who had a very low profile. And when Gene McCarthy went into New Hampshire to challenge a sitting wartime president for the nomination, and did very well, by the way. I'll give you a number in a minute. And for the students, for the young men and women, here is an adult voice, a member of the American Senate, who's willing to go into the snows of New Hampshire and challenge a sitting wartime president with all the power at his disposal, and gain and win something like 42% of the popular vote against a sitting wartime commander-in-chief. And the students followed Gene McCarthy, and maybe somebody here remembers this. They followed Gene McCarthy into New Hampshire. Clean for Gene. The women cut.
Did all of us have things to do with?
Pardon me?
Did everybody here have things to do with 68? I was 10. You were 10? My best friend was an aide to Westmoreland and put down in the Tet Offensive.
Okay. Yeah, and that's,
So I have strong memories of it.
Sure. As Westmoreland would tell his staff, and I got this from my brother, as Westmoreland would tell his staff, my brother's retired brigadier general, and I don't call him general, and he doesn't call me doctor. He's Lance, I'm Gary. He's a good guy. That Westmoreland said there are 3 instances in which I do not want to see any of my staff members photographed in uniform. 1, carrying a parcel under your arm, like you're a FedEx delivery man. 2, holding your own umbrella. In uniform, you have a lieutenant hold the umbrella. And thirdly, pushing a baby carriage in uniform. That is not how a man on my staff presents himself in uniform. That's Westmoreland. Lyndon Johnson gets beat, metaphorically speaking. There are 26 delegates that New Hampshire is going to send to the Democratic National Convention. We're beginning to segue here in August in Chicago. And of the 26, McCarthy won 20. This is a sitting wartime president. And Johnson, and then, when McCarthy had bloodied Johnson in New Hampshire, Robert Kennedy jumped in.
Well, that was, when you were talking about that, that to me was one of the biggest things, was when McCarthy won, and I had just graduated from college, and when McCarthy won, Bobby Kennedy had not put his name into the running. He put his name into the running, I believe, somewhere in, and I may be wrong, somewhere around March, somewhere around St. Patrick's Day.
It was sometime around there. And initially, Robert Kennedy was not going to run, but he was pressured by Ethel and others, and he didn't want to run. He didn't want to run for a couple of reasons. 1, he loathed Lyndon Johnson, and folks thought it would be personal. And secondly, it would disrupt the Democratic Party, fracture the Democratic Party. And thirdly, for Robert, I'm going to wait until 72. Lyndon Johnson's going to run at 68. He's going to be reelected, but all of that changed. All of that changed. And the whole temperature of the situation changed. And then Robert Kennedy's assassinated, and Martin Luther King. 1968 was a bloody year, a very bloody year. It was the bloodiest year in Vietnam. 14,000 American serving personnel, 14,000 plus, perished in 1968. And Lyndon Johnson retired. That he got on television in March, last Sunday in March of 1968, and he stunned the country. He told the country at the close of a speech that I will not, and here are the words he used. He closed both doors. I will not seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party as your president to run for a second term. Now, those are 2 very different words, aren't they? I will not seek, nor will I accept. I'm closing that door, and I'm closing this door. And what pushed him to that decision, the war, and by now, the chant, Lyndon Johnson could not speak anywhere and be heard unless it was on a military base or the deck of an aircraft carrier. And what in 1964, had been the rallying cry of the crowds, all the way with LBJ, all the way with LBJ. And now by 1968, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? Vietnamese children and young American soldiers. and I will not seek nor will I accept. And Lady Bird, Claudia Johnson, was so instrumental in that. And as she told Lyndon, as she told Lyndon that you're drinking too much, and he was. You're smoking too much, and he was. And he couldn't sleep at night, and he could not. And Lyndon, no Johnson man has ever survived beyond his 65th birthday. They've all suffered a fatal... Yeah, I mean, he died 8 months before 65th birthday of a massive coronary. So here's Lady Bird. I want to get you back to Texas, where people know when you're sick and they care when you die. So when Lyndon Johnson retired, that opened up the nomination to any Democrat, who was interested. And of course, we know George McGovern expressed a little bit of interest. Gene McCarthy was very enigmatic. Gene McCarthy, he was so Jesuitical, and that his only topic was the war. I mean, he didn't have, if you will, a whole program to put in front of the American people. And in fact, he was a poor loser. When Hubert Humphrey was nominated, he refused to go on to go on the platform, and everybody raised their hands. He refused to do that. He took it personally. McGovern went up there. There was an effort to draft Ted Kennedy, to run, and Ted said, "I'm 36 years old. I still see a pediatrician. I mean, I'm not ready for this." And it was Mayor Daley, who, the mayor of Chicago, made an effort to try to put Edward Kennedy on the ticket with Hubert Humphrey. But let me back up for a minute. So the nomination for the Democratic Party, really, it opens up. There's a huge vacuum there. And Hubert Humphrey did not enter a single primary. He earned his delegates through the party caucuses and so forth. And Hubert Humphrey was viewed by so many as a clone of Lyndon Johnson. In other words, a vote for Humphrey is a vote for war. A vote for Humphrey is a vote for Lyndon Johnson. He's a stand-in for Lyndon Johnson. And Humphrey, believe me, we could do hours on this. Hubert Humphrey, a good guy, but as Lyndon Johnson said, he suffers from the Minnesota disease. And by that, Lyndon Johnson meant he cannot stop talking. He doesn't know where to put a period. He must be German. Just goes on and on and on and on and on. And Humphrey had so much difficulty trying to distance himself from Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson tortured people. On the one hand, he would console you, he would hug you, smother you with love, and 20 minutes later, he'd be after you. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was an absolute tsunami of a man. Lyndon Johnson probably had some type of a nervous breakdown as president. Bob McNamara did. But I want to come back for a minute. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, this is why I said the Hanoi got much more out of this than he ever expected. A number of things fell out of the Tet Offensive, unexpected. One was this. Westmoreland was recalled, replaced by Creighton Abrams, who was more interested in pacification. I don't want to get into that. Number two, Robert McNamara resigned, or was fired, or had a nervous breakdown, and resigned as Secretary of Defense. I mean, it was as much Lyndon Johnson's war as it was Robert McNamara's war, and he knew this. McNamara knew the war was lost in '67. He knew it. And the only way that he could measure success was the notorious body count. If it's dead and Vietnamese, it's the enemy. And that, as the military told McNamara, and as the military told Johnson, the phrase was, there's a crossover point. If we can inflict enough casualties on the enemy, if we can have attrition 10-1, they lose 10, we lose 1. They lose 20, we lose 2. If we can inflict enough casualty, enough pain, enough suffering, there's a crossover point. And Ho Chi Minh and the others back in Hanoi said, oh, there's a crossover point. And the Americans have a crossover point. And at some point, they will go home. Our ancestors 1,000 years ago beat off the Chinese. We got rid of the Chinese. We defeated the French twice. We got rid of the Japanese, so now the Americans have come. You know, they're the new occupiers, they're the new colonials, and we will defeat them. That they do not take casualties well, and that they have a crossover point. And this is Ho Chi Minh. It is the duty of your generation. And he said this to the young men, the young women, the older women, the older men, to die for your country. There is a crossover point. The Americans are the occupiers. They divided our country at the 17th parallel, and we need to defeat them. We need to send them home. So let me reboot this. Westmoreland's recalled. McNamara resigns. Lyndon Johnson declares a bombing halt above the 28th parallel. Lyndon Johnson also tells President Tu, there will be no more troops. We're going to cap the number of troops that are deployed. President Tu knew that was the end of the line. And peace negotiations are going to begin in May of 1968 in Paris. But that's not the major domino that fell. The major outcome of this, Walter Cronkite turned on the war. There's no one today who has the cachet, the believability of Walter Cronkite. No one. For my father, a decorated World War II vet, from my father, Illinois, Richard Nixon's silent majority, that if Walter Cronkite said it, it's true. That was my dad. If Walter Cronkite said it, it was true. That all Walter Cronkite had to do was look into the camera at the end of his CBS News broadcast and look puzzled, look quizzical, and bounce those big bushy eyebrows up and down. And he could, when he moved those eyebrows, he could move poll numbers. And Cronkite went to Vietnam in the aftermath of Tet. And he talked to the generals whom he had to talk to, but he talked to the lieutenants, and he talked to the lieutenant colonels and others. And he came back with a different story. There's no way we can win this thing. And in April, it was in March of 1968, Gene McCarthy and Cronkite, at the close of his news program, looked into the camera, bounced those eyebrows around, and said, "We are an honorable people, and we have maintained our alliance and our responsibilities toward the government of South Vietnam. But we are in a stalemate." That's his word. Stalemate in Vietnam. I don't know who won. I don't know who lost the Tet Offensive. But I do know we're in a stalemate. We're in a quagmire. And that sent a lot of people to their dictionaries. What was a quagmire? And as he said, that it's time to come home. Lyndon Johnson was a TV junkie, just like our current president, always watching the news. And he only had to watch 3 televisions, by the way. Those were different days. And when Lyndon Johnson heard Walter Cronkite turn on the war, he heaved his 6'5" frame out of the chair, switched off 1, 2, 3 channels, and as those who were watching television said to him, "We've just lost the war. We've lost Cronkite, and I'm done." And that led to a vacuum in terms of who would be nominated in 1968. Hubert Humphrey received the nomination, but he was so unable to break with Johnson. Johnson tortured Humphrey. And that convention was a disaster, both in the streets. You know, the anti-war movement, you know, followed the Democratic Party to Chicago. And we have that police riot, you know, the riot on Michigan Avenue. And all of that, you know, came into our homes, didn't it? You know, the police beating and gassing, you know, the young men, older men, young women, older women, and all of that beamed across the country. Pardon me?
Weren't they also beating up on the
I can't hear you.
Weren't they also beating up on the delegates as they left the convention hall?
It also, there was chaos on the floor as well. Is that what you're asking me?
Well, as the convention delegates left, they got caught up in all that.
Oh, yeah, right. But there was chaos on the floor of the convention over a peace plank. Lyndon Johnson wanted no peace plank. You know, that in effect, a peace plank in the platform, he thought it was personal. And that peace plank, which was being pressed by the the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the peace wing of the Democratic Party, called for a coalition government, a ceasefire in place where the enemy could remain below the 17th parallel, and it called for the beginning of a drawdown of American forces. Lyndon Johnson, this is a complete repudiation of my leadership. And Hubert Humphrey dare not go near that and repudiate that. He knew Lyndon Johnson would come after.
At the same time, when the Democratic Convention occurred, nobody understood what was really going on in Vietnam. What you were just saying, I think, was one of the problems that they had with the Democratic Convention was Howard K. Smith was arrested. I mean,
Dan Rather was arrested.
It was Dan Rather, okay, it was Dan Rather. That was
Dan
arrested.
Rather was roughed
Yeah.
up by the delegates. And Dan Rather, that was caught on television, and Dan Rather on his headset up to Walter Cronkite, talking about I'm being roughed up, I've been punched in the stomach. He went to the floor. And Cronkite, and with his contempt, are you okay, Dan? Are you okay? There are thugs on this floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that went out across the country. The peace plank was defeated. It was defeated by a 3-2 vote, but it was chaos. You know who's watching all of this? And I want to drop this. I want to insert this right now before I forget. The Republican Party, I'm going to come back to Richard Nixon, the Republican Party had already had their convention. And Richard Nixon was a shrewd, smart man who mastered the details. He was good at what he did. And he got off a great line. And this line was repeated, became part of the stump speech in the general election. And the line was this: if Hubert Humphrey cannot run a convention, how can he run the country? Terrific. If he cannot run a convention, how can he run the party? In fact, Humphrey did not want the convention in Chicago. He wanted it in Miami because the security was better. And to use the convention hall the Republicans had used. But Lyndon Johnson said, no, it's going to be in Chicago. I promised Dick Daley it's going to be in Chicago. And Dick Daley wanted no part of trouble. 20 blocks of downtown Chicago had burned in the days following the assassination of King. And that's why the cops were out there. And it was a police riot. And we all remember Senator Abraham Ribicoff, condemning the Gestapo-like tactics, and that's the word he used, the Gestapo-like tactics of the Chicago police. And Mayor Daley, and this was caught on shouting him, yelling at him, and telling him to, well, it begins with F, and you could see his lips moving, and that went across the country. When Hubert Humphrey accepted the nomination, and he ran with Ed Muskie, he needed to distance himself from Lyndon Johnson. He never got to the point of being able to articulate what would a Humphrey presidency look like. His more aggressive advisors at the convention suggested that Humphrey do something bold and daring, shift the whole momentum away from Lyndon Johnson. And do you know what they recommended? And Hubert Humphrey just didn't have it to do it. They recommended Vice President Humphrey, at the end of your acceptance speech, resign as Vice President. And that will distance yourself from Lyndon. Resign as Vice President. It would have been dramatic. It may have been a game changer. It would have liberated Hubert Humphrey, freed him. Now, but he said, I can't do that. Constitutionally, there's a better word for that. I can't do that. He said it's a gimmick. It would have changed the whole flow. But he knew that Lyndon Johnson, listening to Hubert Humphrey, that Lyndon Johnson's head would have blown off his neck. He would have screwed it back on and flew down to Chicago to take the nomination. In fact, Hubert Humphrey, many delegates believe that Lyndon Johnson would suddenly, show up like Merlin, like a wizard, that I've changed my mind, I want the nomination. It did not happen, but some believe that it would happen. And so Johnson is difficult for him Humphrey, to separate from Lyndon Johnson. I'll come back to this. The Republican convention, very buttoned up. that Nixon had dispatched with a possible challenge from Rockefeller. And he offered Rockefeller, by the way, the vice presidency. And Rockefeller made it clear, I'm not second fiddle to anybody. I'm Nelson Rockefeller. I either get the nomination, but I'm not going to be number two. I'm not going to be a bridesmaid. You know, I'm Nelson Rockefeller. And Nixon, as I said, the number one issue was the war. And Nixon, this is a new Nixon. And I've traveled. I've been defeated. In fact, I mean, Nixon had to overcome the loser's image. I mean, he'd been defeated in 1960, and then when we returned to California, defeated by Governor Brown in the race for governorship. So Nixon had that loser image, and he was very adroitly able to develop the concept, I'm a new Nixon. I've traveled, I've read, I've written, I've learned, and I'm willing to offer myself to the country. And for Vietnam, peace with honor, peace with honor. That I have a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Well, he did. He did. It was so secret even he didn't know about it. But the way Nixon handled this very shrewdly, very cleverly, that I'm not going to reveal my thoughts on the Vietnam War, but because I don't want to interfere with the ongoing peace process. And if peace can be had before the election, so be it. Now, I didn't mean that, but I didn't have to mean it. I am not going to politicize this war. If we can end this war before the election, I'm all for it. And if it's not ended in November and I win the White House, I will ask Lyndon Johnson permission, just as Dwight Eisenhower did when he won in '52, that I will go to Paris before I'm inaugurated and see what I can do to facilitate peace. Just as Dwight Eisenhower, winning in November of 1952, had gone to Korea in December of 1952 to take a first-hand look at the war. I'm not going to politicize it, but I have peace with honor and law and order. Law and order. And we're going to do something about the chaos in the streets, burn, baby, burn, and all of that. Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Eldridge Cleaver. Law and order. The first right of every American is to be safe on the streets. The first right of every American is to be safe in their homes. I'm going after a court, the Warren Court, which is out of control, where the Warren Court is more concerned about the rights of defendants than the rights of victims. We're going to turn that around. The Warren Court has given a green light to criminal behavior, the Miranda ruling, the right to a court-appointed attorney, to have an attorney present when you're quizzed by the cops. The cops cannot do their job. And I'm going to appoint conservative judges at the national level. It's time to have a new America. Nixon's the one. I'm the one. He campaigned on that. And the dirty work, I'm above the fray. And just as I did the dirty work for Eisenhower, Spiro Agnew will do the dirty work for me. I'm above the fray. I'm a new Nixon. And I'm not going to debate Hubert Humphrey. See, Humphrey needed the debates. When Nixon came out of that convention, he was 15 points ahead. And Nixon knew I should never have debated John Kennedy. I had him beat, and I debated him. Eisenhower advised me not to debate him, that he needs the debates, you don't. And Nixon said, I'm going to debate him. But I'm not going to debate Hubert Humphrey, because I learned my lesson. And Hubert Humphrey wanted those debates. And he would refer to Nixon as Richard the chicken-hearted. The chicken-hearted, not the lion-hearted. Richard the silent. I'm not debating him. What I will do is I will be, as he called it, the man in the arena. He used Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, that I will go and I will have forums with the audience very carefully screened. I don't want any trouble. Questions that I'm prepared to answer, and I will answer them not behind a podium or not behind a microphone, that I will walk on stage, and I am the man in the arena. I am alone, I am fearless, and I will take any question that you have, and I will speak to you directly and truthfully. I'm the one. I'm the one. And we need to bring law and order. We need to do something about a Supreme Court that's out of control. And we need to end this war. What the Nixon team feared is, and this is a term we still use today, they feared an October surprise. That something would happen a week or 2 or 10 days before the election that might pull Hubert Humphrey over the finish line. Johnson would do something or push him over the finish line. The only break, there are 2 breaks, 3 breaks maybe, that Humphrey establishes with Johnson. One is this, and it's so lame that when he spoke, I'm looking at the podium here, that he removed the vice presidential seal. It's pretty lame. I'm trying to create some distance here. He talked about a bombing halt. Lyndon Johnson was furious at him. Talked about a bombing halt. And he did that at Salt Lake City in September 30th, I remember. Only because this is that's what I do for a living. I have all the stuff in my head. I got too much stuff in my head. On September 30th in Salt Lake City. See you later.
I'll be back.
All right. A bombing halt. I took the vice presidential insignia off the podium. Lyndon Johnson. You ready for this? You ready for this? How Lyndon Johnson tortured Hubert Humphrey? Lyndon Johnson did not formally endorse Humphrey until November 3rd. The election was November 5th. He did that deliberately. The Republicans feared an October surprise. Now, this only recently has found its way into the general narrative, into the textbooks. Henry Kissinger, and I don't want to get into him. He's not one of my favorite people. Henry Kissinger wanted power. And I don't care how I get it. I want power. I want to be a national security advisor and to be able to shape American foreign policy. I want to be able to be at the table and take this raw clay and shape it into a brand new world vision. And just as, and this was his political hero and the subject of his doctoral dissertation, Lord Metternich. There's no reason why you should even know that name. Metternich was the foreign minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And at the end of the chaotic wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Metternich called a conference in Vienna. And it was a glittering conference of all the heads of Europe and to restore order to Europe. Metternich. It was the Congress of Vienna. And I want to have that authority. And he thought he would be able to have that power, working for Nelson Rockefeller. But Rockefeller did not get the nomination in '64, did not get it in '68. And what Kissinger did is he offered his resources to the Democrats, to Hubert Humphrey. That he said, I really can't work for Nixon. See, Kissinger referred to Nixon as a first-rate, third-rate. You don't want that to get back to the president. He referred to my drunken friend. And he went to work in Paris providing advice to Averell Harriman, who was the lead negotiator.
Is that his drunken friend?
In Paris, Averell Harriman. Harriman's the guy that recommended to Humphrey, at the end of your acceptance address, resign as vice president. You want to be bold? You want to distance yourself? You want to talk to the American people about what a Humphrey presidency would look like? Do that. He couldn't do it. He just could not do that. He just wasn't made up of that stuff. Lyndon Johnson privately would say, I think Nixon would make a better president. He's more decisive. He's more of a throat cutter. Hubert Humphrey's too nice. In any event, it's so, talk about infighting and backstabbing. Never mind today. It goes all the way back. Kissinger makes a phone call to John Mitchell. Now, John Mitchell had been the senior law partner. Nixon had worked for Mitchell when he got beat in California. And Mitchell had urged him to run again. It was in his blood. As Haldeman and Ehrlichman say, Nixon had a fire in his belly to be president. So Kissinger makes a phone call, or somebody on Kissinger's staff, you ready for this? Makes a phone call to John Mitchell. Said, I've got something you want to know. I've got some inside dope. And you want to prevent an October surprise? I'm going to tell you something. They're close here in Paris to signing an agreement. Harriman talks about popping the cork off the champagne bottle. They're close. But let me tell you something. Now, we've never had this phone call, have we, Mr. Mitchell? No, sir. President II of Vietnam has the authority to say no to any deal. If he says no, it's no. And there's going to be an October surprise coming. But you can stop it. If you can get the word to President II, I don't know how you're going to do it, but you keep my name out of it, because it's a violation of the Logan Act, which you've never heard of. The Logan Act is a felony. Goes all the way back to John Adams in 1799, in which someone who's not a member of the government interferes with diplomatic negotiations. Who's that nitwit that went to Korea with all the tats?
Rodman.
Yeah, I mean, he violated the Logan Act. You know, an individual taking responsibility, trying to influence. Get the word to II, that if he says no, he'll get a better deal on the Nixon watch. And Nixon and John Mitchell remembered the fact that Humphrey was betrayed by Kissinger. And that betrayal led to 21,000 more deaths in Vietnam, because there was no secret plan. Let me back up again. Get the word to President II that if he says no, all he has to do is say no. I'm uncomfortable with the deal on the table, that you'll get a better deal in a Nixon presidency. Now, how do we get the word to President II? We get the word to President II. There's no reason you'd remember this name. Anna Chennault, and her husband had been part of the Flying Tigers, or maybe her dad, you know, during World War II. Anna Chennault. And she was part of, back home in the United States, part of the China lobby, Asia First lobby, and she had a direct phone line to President II. I mean, they were friends, confidants. And she called him up and said, I've got word from the Nixon people, say no to the deal. It's a bad deal. It's an in-place ceasefire. The enemy is going to remain in place. You'll be arm-twisted in accepting a coalition government. You will get a better deal from Nixon. Say no. And that word was also passed from the ambassador, the South Vietnamese ambassador to Washington, by the ambassador whose name escapes me. And that word went right to President II. Say no. And II said no. And there is no October surprise. And the war continued, didn't it? You know, for another 7 years with 21,000 more deaths. And not to be dramatic, Kissinger is not my favorite person. He was sneaky. He was reptilian. He wanted to be the first person Nixon spoke to in the morning, and the last person in the evening. He was miserable to people who worked for him, and he wanted complete control, and to make sure that Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense, was kept at a distance because he couldn't manipulate him. Secretary of Rogers, William Rogers of State, kept at a distance. A manipulative creature, you know, who wanted access. I want power. I want to be in the cover of Time. I want to be in the cover of Newsweek. And I can only do that by betraying Humphrey. And he did. He did. Ete brute. Ete Hubert Humphrey. And there will be no debates. And on election day, it was too close to call in 1968, because that lead, as they all do, you know, that 15-point lead that Nixon took out of Miami, you know, began to shrink and shrink and shrink. And that's why the fear was that there will be this October surprise, and Lyndon Johnson will push Hubert Humphrey over the finish line, or pull him over the finish line. But if you stop it, Mr. Nixon, if we stop it in its tracks, if we throw a monkey wrench in it, and that was the word he used to Bob Haldeman, that very word, monkey wrench. If we can shut it down, will get elected. I have a secret plan. But I'm not going to say what it is because I know what the plan is. And in January of 1969, Richard Nixon is sworn in, and we have the beginning of the Nixon presidency, don't we? And the plan is, and I'll close here, we'll do some questions. If you have any, we've got time. The plan is, and this is Melvin Laird, to begin a gradual drawdown. And the phrase was Vietnamization. And what it meant was to change the complexion of the casualties. We'll turn the fighting back over to the South Vietnamese. You see, there's an arc here that Eisenhower sent in advisors. Kennedy sent in advisors. And also authorized the use of napalm. Kennedy did. Napalm and Agent Orange. And then Lyndon Johnson escalated recklessly. And then came Tet. And then with the Nixon administration and Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, Vietnamization. Turn the fighting back over to the Vietnamese. They have to win it. We can't win it for them. And as too was told by President Nixon, we will continue to supply you with munitions. We will continue to run air raids, over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But we're leaving, and you cannot say no. You have no veto power over the deal. You either accept it or you don't. We are coming home. We are turning the fighting over to the Army of South Vietnam, who were absolutely incompetent, fearful of the enemy, and they would sell their weapons rather than use them. And so you've got this arc here. And in April of '73, the United States pulls out its final combat troops. You see, but by April of '73, Richard Nixon is not concerned about the survival of President II. He's concerned about the survival of himself, because of April of '73, that Watergate, that spider web of Watergate, is beginning to wind itself around senior members of the White House staff. And we all remember that, don't we? And that was a crisis of confidence. And that came about so slowly. And remember Senator Bai, what did the president know? And when did he know it? It was a great question, wasn't it? What did the president know? And when did he know it? But that's another story, for another evening. So here we have it this evening, conflating the Tet Offensive, which turned everything topsy-turvy and had an enormous impact on the 1968 election. And Nixon identifying his core support, the silent majority. That's his term, the silent majority. I appeal to the non-shouters, to the non-demonstrators. I appeal to those persons who pay their taxes, who support their government, who go to church, who stay married. I support those people, where the children know the identity of their father. That's who I represent, the silent majority, the non-shouters, the non-protesters. And he won a substantial electoral victory in the upper Midwest and the Midwest and parts of the South, the emerging Republican majority in the South, which is there today, and was first identified in '64 when Barry Goldwater ran. Barry Goldwater gave his unflinching support to Nixon and helped Nixon secure the right, because Nixon had supported Goldwater in '64. And Nixon cashed in that chit. Hold the right. I'll appeal to the right center and talk a little bit about some of my social programs. It'll be Nixon, by the way, who will father the Environmental Protection Act, which is under total assault today. So we'll close it there. We're going to put a period right there. And there's no homework. I knew that you would find that helpful. How about, anybody have a question or something, or maybe something I can draw out for you a little bit? We have two more of these coming. And one of them is the Ellsberg piece, Daniel Ellsberg. And I don't know what the third one is.
It was, according to the report here, was the election of '68.
Yeah, but there's another one and another one. I'm going to do Ellsberg, and I don't remember. Something else is coming up. So before I leave, and I know it stopped raining, can I help you with anything?
I mean, you just mentioned Goldwater supported Nixon. Wasn't Goldwater the one that in the end?
Okay, speak up a little bit.
Isn't Goldwater the one in the end who convinced him to resign?
I can't hear you.
He convinced you to resign.
I can't hear you. What?
Isn't Goldwater the one that in the end convinced Nixon to resign?
Yes, Goldwater, and Hugh Scott of Nebraska, and House Minority Leader Rhodes of, I don't know where he was from, went to Nixon and told him, you have, pardon me?
Hugh Scott? Nebraska?
Hugh Scott, Nebraska. Barry Goldwater,
I
Arizona,
don't know why.
and
Hugh
Rhodes.
Scott was Pennsylvania.
No, it was Nebraska. And Rhodes of the House Minority Leader. They went to Nixon. And this is after the House Judiciary Committee had passed 3 articles of impeachment. You know, abuse of power, refusing to, submit to congressional requests, abuse of power, obstruction of justice. Boy, those are very general terms, aren't they? Obstruction of justice and abuse of power, and that's just what the framers were looking for. And I do a whole thing on impeachment. I don't politicize it. It's just, why did the framers put it in the Constitution? I carry one with me everywhere. I have it in every suit coat pocket, every sport coat pocket, and if I have jeans on, I have it in my back pocket. Because whenever you get stopped by the cops, all you have to do is show this, and they say, go along, young man. Go along. You're a good citizen. I made that up, but I always carry it. And they went to Nixon, and they said, you've got 3 articles of impeachment, that have been passed by the Judiciary Committee, and they're going to be voted on by the House of Representatives. And it's going to happen, Mr. President. And then Scott and Goldwater. You maybe have 26 votes in the Senate. You will be impeached and then convicted by the Senate. And now it'll become a criminal activity, which means you're going to lose your pension, which means you'll lose your Secret Service protection, which means you will lose your franking privileges, which means you might go to prison. 43 people went to prison in the aftermath of the Watergate. And Nixon, that's where he talked about the man in the arena. Came back to that, and I'd rather resign than suffer the consequences. And it will be Ford, our long national nightmare is over. Ford lost election in his own right because he pardoned Nixon 30 days later, in my view. And Jimmy Carter got off a great line in '76, and great line. The American people deserve a government as good as they are. And when you decode that, you decode all the crimes of Watergate, you see, all the lying. The American people deserve a government as good as they are. And that was very easily decoded by voters and the media. And President Carter, you never want to say this, I will never lie to you. No president can ever say that. I will never lie to you. You might have to wiggle a little bit, but you never say that. I wouldn't say it, because you have to. Sometimes you need a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit. It's, you know what it's called? I call it plausible deniability. I never said that. I never agreed to that. I never used those words. Plausible deniability. Did you read the piece on where somebody saying that letter that showed up in the New York Times came from Pence? Because Pence uses the word lodestar a lot, and the word lodestar appeared in that letter, so they're trying to track it back to Pence. It wasn't Pence. I don't know who it was, but
We're wasting too much time trying to figure out
it wasn't
what
Pence.
What it says.
When do we meet again? In October?
No, I don't know, but I thought it was every week for the next 3 weeks, but
I don't think it is.
They don't have it
I think there's a break. I've got to check my calendar.
It wasn't in September, because I looked after.
Yeah, because I
Yes.
called in and I said, when are the other 3? You say a 3-part series, but it only had tonight
Okay.
on the calendar.
Yeah,
so I
right.
didn't know.
Well, you know why? Because the director left.
Barbara told
The
me
director
it
left
was-
and went to Canton.
Barbara told me it would be October and November.
Yeah, I know it's October. I don't know when.
She didn't have the dates for me, but
I know
said
she
it would
didn't,
be-
because the director left and went to Canton, and that's who I worked with, and now I'm working with her in Canton as well. I get around. I'm like oxygen. I get around.
When you were talking about McNamara having a nervous breakdown, could you expound on that a bit? Because I don't remember that.
McNamara's age, and again, this is because you don't have to read the stuff I read, I don't think. and I don't know what you do for a living. And
That's right, you don't.
and McNamara at meetings, and as the casualties came in, and knowing that it's not winnable, there was no plan to win this thing. There's no road to victory. It wasn't like taking North Vietnam. That was never the goal. The goal was to protect the independence of South Vietnam, a nation that the United States created in 1957 with a capital and handpicked ZM, their president. McNamara knew it couldn't be won. And it just, aides would remember that he would begin to weep at meetings, and he would get up.
He became obsessed with the death numbers.
Obsessed. And he would go and look out the window, and they would notice that he would be using the drapes to try to dry the tears. And it broke him. It broke Johnson. It broke McNamara. And one way that Lyndon Johnson tried to ease the pain for McNamara is that he appointed him president of the World Bank to make loans to developing countries or destroyed countries to help them develop. Now, I don't know how much that money ever went to Vietnam, but I do know that Vietnam is a strong ally of the United States. It's on the tourist site, and I've never been, but I know people that have been, and the Vietnamese are very lovely and gracious to American tourists. And so we'll leave it at that. McNamara never recovered. I'll tell you who told the truth to Johnson, and he left too. Undersecretary of State George Ball told the truth. And Johnson only kept him around as his closet dove, so he could always say, well, I'm hearing the other side. He didn't hear it. He heard sounds, but he didn't hear it. I'm going to win this war. I don't want to be the only president to lose a war. If I could only get Ho Chi Minh in this Oval Office and sit him down and Johnsonize him. That became a verb, to be Johnsonized. And Lyndon Johnson would pressure you. He'd spit in your face. He'd be all over you, kneecap to kneecap, lean right in. What do you need? What do you need? What does it take, Senator, to have your vote tomorrow morning? It's going to be a tough vote, Senator. How can I help you? I know you need a new airport out there in Montana. I can make that happen. I need your vote. Your president needs your vote tomorrow morning. I want your president to be proud of you. He would reduce that to speaking about himself in the third person. And he used the phone like Excalibur. I mean, he was on the phone all day. He had 2 24-hour days. He napped. It's one way to stretch your time. Eleanor Roosevelt knew that trick. Take a nap. Take power naps. And you can stretch your day out. You can have 2 24 hours a day if you nap sufficiently and recharge and stay away from the wine, because that'll get you tired. Lyndon Johnson liked his scotch, but he always told the guys working in the White House, when I'm Johnsonizing somebody, pour heavy for them and just give me a quarter shot. And that way I can tolerate it. Pour heavy on them and I can Johnsonize them. Lyndon Johnson was a master at getting things done. Lyndon Johnson brought to life John Kennedy's promise of a new frontier. The Great Society is the new frontier, rewritten and expanded 10 times more generous than the new frontier. But these are all different stories for different times. When Johnson met the Pope, and he met the Pope, his aides were absolutely, they couldn't believe what Johnson did. He's talking to the Pope. He's talking to the Pope.
Which
and
one?
I don't keep track of the popes. That's my next job. I want to be Pope. But I'm not a Catholic. But I can work that out. I know enough Latin, I can fake it. Getting out on the balcony on Easter Sunday, and what. I'm a Lutheran. So Johnson is talking to the Pope. And Johnson's aides are with him. And Johnson leans into the Pope and taps him on the kneecap to make his point. Can you imagine? To tap the Pope. And by the way, Your Excellency,
He's like he didn't show
that's
up.
Johnson. And his aides said, I can't believe it. And then Johnson, you always gift a head of state. The Pope gave Johnson a beautiful Renaissance miniature painting, a minimalist painting. Johnson gave the Pope a 2-foot bust of himself. That's Lyndon Johnson. That's Lyndon Johnson. All the way with LBJ. You want to read Doris Kearns Goodwin. and her memories of working with Lyndon Johnson. That is that's an eye-opener of a book. Okay, I'm done overnight. All right, thank you for your company. These proceedings are closed. Classes dismissed. As they say, below the Mason-Dixon line, dismissed. See you later.
Thank you.
I'll see you.